The newest enclosure on the market is Be Quiet's Darkbase 700, loosely related to the high-cost Darkbase Pro 900 invertible enclosure. The 700 retains the invertible motherboard option, but reduces physical size and uses different tooling in key locations. The Darkbase 700 also markets itself as a mid-tower alternative to the 900, with a focus on silent operation and cooling combined. Generally speaking, it's impossible to chart top for both of these aspects in a case, but Be Quiet employs a fan speed switch with multiple speed settings to give users options. Today, we're reviewing the case at its $180 price point as compared to alternatives on the market. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our coffee lake temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. We just pushed our case awards video for the year before this one went live, but already knew everything about it because we'd been testing it for a while. So first thing here, one of the items we noted in that case awards video was a general lack of USB Type-C in modern cases for the year. The Darkbase 700, this case, actually has a Type-C in the front next to a fan controller, and if you look closely at it, it's a repurposed normal USB Type-A slot, two of them, that have been given Type-C and a fan controller. So basically it looks like the tooling was already done and Be Quiet went back and modified it or took old tooling from something else and then put those two items in the same port with just some filler plastic around it. Pretty clever solution because most of the other cases on the market haven't figured that out yet. So we'll point that out. Now the marketing push here is focusing on both silence and noise, and it's effectively impossible to do both of those well. So that comes back to the fan controller. The fan controller on this has two different toggles, silence and performance mode, and then it's got 3 speed levels for those. So you switch between the 3 speed levels, you pick either silence or performance, and then you basically judge what you need based on your workload. As for core features, this is an invertible case, meaning that the motherboard tray can again be flipped upside down and moved to the other side of the case, and every component of the case, side panels, hard drive cages, power supply shroud, etc., can be repositioned to fit this configuration. Some of our complaints with the 900 have been resolved now. The manual has a single chapter of step-by-step instructions, for instance, and there are clearly defined layouts, standard or inverted, to choose from within the manual. One of the best things about the 700's invertibility is that it's practically unnoticeable when unused. There are no weird compromises made to make the invertible layout possible, and that's just like the 900 was. The motherboard tray of the 700 can be removed sort of painlessly. There are 11 screws that hold it in place, and it can be used as a test bench if you really wanted to, as it even has little legs on the corners for this purpose. The PSU shroud is the most visible difference from the Darkbase 900. 4 removable plastic sections cover the top of the shroud, and 1 large plastic panel covers the side. The underlying steel framework is permanent, but these plastic sections can be removed as desired or shifted around for inversion. The plastic panels are slightly popped up to leave small airflow gaps as a common feature with Be Quiet cases. There are no 3.5-inch bays visible in the 700, but that doesn't mean they aren't there. There are 5 mounting points beside the motherboard for the Be Quiet distinctive free-floating hard drive bay deployment that they tend to use. Each is capped by an adjustable plastic cover that allows room for cable routing when not in use. The 2 bays included with the case are hidden beneath the power supply shroud for a total of 7 possible 3.5-inch locations, although only 2 can be used simultaneously without additional bays. The +2 PCI slots listed in the spec sheet refers to the vertical GPU mount, which proved as difficult to use as always is for any type of GPU that is a taller PCB in combination with an air cooler. This happens whether or not you have an open loop setup on your GPU. It's just that as long as you use a reference board, you'll be fine. Otherwise, you can use a taller GPU but no air cooler, one or the other. There's relatively little clearance between the shroud and the edge of the card where the PCIe riser cable plugs in, and some cables may be difficult to fit without removing the panels from the shroud. Getting into testing, the fan controller has 3 manual settings and auto, which accepts PWM input from the motherboard's fan header. One important note is that the fan controller has 2 channels, each of which can separately be set to either silent or performance, with toggles on the PCB. Both channels were set to silent by default in our sample. In silent mode level 3, which we used for most tests, the Silent Wings 3 fans run at about 1100 RPM, which is the maximum speed while in silent mode. Performance mode level 3, used in the max fan speed tests, pushes them to their rated speed of 1600 RPM and is, expectedly, significantly louder. When using just the stock fans, we'd recommend using performance mode. Level 1 is still quiet and level 3 is the greatest possible airflow, but the silent mode is more of what is marketed toward. With additional fans of differing speeds, users could experiment with setting one channel to performance and one to silent. The idea is ultimately that you set multiple zones in the case, but we'd recommend generally just matching them to the fan speeds for the least turbulent noise. There's obviously a big focus on silence in every Be Quiet case. That's kind of the name. The tempered glass models like this one can't have as much noise damping foam as the previous versions without windows. 3 panels, front, top, and side, are padded, and the thicker glass will at least help with reducing long wavelength noise from exiting the case, though it doesn't help with higher frequency stuff like coil whine. There's a reason why we didn't do every test at 1600 RPM. Max fan speeds, looking at our noise chart now, reached 43.4 dBA, and that's on the same level as the Corsair 570X running 3 fans at 1550 RPM, and the Silverstone RL06 with 4 120 fans and completely ventilated mesh. What Be Quiet calls L-shaped noise damping vents end up backfiring when too much air is forced through them. The pressure is just creating turbulence and noise, and the 90-degree turns mean that you're losing some pressure every time. The Silent Wing's 3 fans are capable of moving a lot of air, but they're also fighting the front panel, just like a lot of cases these days. The difference here is that Be Quiet actually advertises silence, so the closed-off front panel is sort of necessary to achieve that to the maximum potential. It's just a question of when they've gone too far. We can look at that in the thermal results to see if that's the case. At level 3 silent mode, roughly 1100 RPM, noise levels were much more reasonable, around the Roswell Cullinan and Corsair 270R. Level 1 slowed the fans to just 450 to 500 RPM, but it also made the 700 quieter than anything we've tested since the Pure Bass 600, also at minimum RPM. Level 3 silent is a good compromise between noise and airflow for testing purposes. It just becomes a question again of where the thermals land. We'll look at that next. In addition to the stock configuration at fan level 3 silent, we tested maximum and minimum fan speeds as governed by the controller, mounted the GPU vertically, and removed all the plastic covers from the shroud. Our thermal tests start with torture workloads, which burn the CPU and GPU simultaneously. Temperatures are reported as delta T over ambient. Again, we're starting with just the Dark Base 700, then adding the others. With no fan pointed directly at the cooler, the stock configuration, CPU delta T rose to 60.6 degrees Celsius. Cranking the fans up to their maximum speed lowered the delta to 54.6, and turning them all the way down raised it to 74.6, where we saw definite thermal throttling on the CPU. We rarely see this. The minimum fan speed should never be used under serious load, especially not in a torture test like this. We recommend only using minimum fan speeds when dealing with idle or near idle working states like web browsing. It is then critical to remember to turn that back up when you start gaming, rendering, or doing anything intensive. That's the important part. Remember to change it. Mounting the GPU vertically lowered CPU temperatures slightly to 57.3 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient, and that's pretty much been what we've seen in past tests. This is primarily because the card is no longer radiating heat directly into the CPU cooler, and it doesn't block air flowing into it. Removing plastic sections from the shroud potentially raised the CPU temperature, but the results were within test variance and deviation. Comparative temperatures are next. 60.6 degrees Celsius delta T is relatively warm, around the InWin 303 and BitPhoenix Shogun, and just slightly cooler than the toasty Antec P8 or BitPhoenix Enso. At that fan speed, it's also as loud or louder than all of them. 54.6 is a more respectable delta, around solid performers like the Corsair 270R and Thermaltake View 71, but it's also much louder than all the nearby cases. The Dark Base 700 fails to offer superior noise to thermal performance in its stock configuration, and does not offer particularly compelling standalone thermals or particularly compelling standalone noise. That is, not until we go to minimum fan speeds for low load operation, but the minimum fan speed allowed our CPU to hit 100 degrees Celsius during thermal testing, so it can be considered a failure in the range of the InWin 805 Infinity. Overall, CPU temperatures were a bit disappointing, but there's only one intake fan and it's not pointed at the CPU. It's still an improvement over the Pure Bass 600, but at its best instances, this case is simply middle of the pack, nothing special at all. GPU thermal results are next, starting again with data for just the Dark Base 700. Our 1100 RPM fan settings scored a GPU DT of 52.3 degrees Celsius, and maxing out the fans only lowered that a couple of degrees to 50.5 degrees Celsius. Lowering the fan speed predictably spiked temperature up to 58.9 over ambient. Mounting the GPU vertically caused the usual overheating, this time reaching a delta T of 70.4 degrees Celsius, while removing shroud sections again had practically no effect at all. The intention was to allow more air to circulate the bottom of the case and lower GPU temperatures, but the stock intake fan is positioned right above the PSU shroud, so that does its job just fine, regardless of whether the shroud is there. Comparing GPU temperatures reveals where all the incoming air is going. 52.3 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient is comparable to the NZXT H700i and the Thermaltake Core P3 open air case. The maximum performance of 50.5 degrees Celsius pushes it to the top of the GPU chart alongside the Cooler Master C700P. Even with the fans at minimum speed, the GPU temperature isn't at the bottom of the chart like it was for CPU temperature, and 58.9 degrees Celsius is still several degrees under the Bitphoenix Enso and Antec P8. The Darkbase 700 does significantly better in its GPU cooling, making us wonder if relocating the rear exhaust fan as front intake may be better for the CPU thermals when using air coolers. The 700 GPU thermals in 3D Mark Firestrike are among the best performers in the stress test. That's a result of two things. One, all of the air is going straight to the GPU, and we've already proven that the GPU does much better than the CPU. And two, we haven't tested as many cases in this benchmark, so there's less competition. At 54.6 degrees Celsius, the case is slightly outdone by the Thermaltake View 71. Even though this test tends to cause even higher GPU temperatures than the Torture test, the Darkbase handled it well. The CPU temperature of 35°C in this test was comparatively warm, looking at the others, and nearer the Spec 04 or Thermaltake G21. Moving on to Blender, a realistic Blender CPU workload had the CPU temperature still relatively warm at 39.5 degrees Celsius, just a bit over the Thermaltake G21. That's far away from TJ Maxx, but outperformed by the Darkbase 900 and even the H500P, a thermally unimpressive case. Rendering our test image on the GPU resulted in GPU temperatures of 26 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient, again comparable to the View 71 and competitively cool. The 700 outperforms the 900 here, as well as most of the other cases we've tested with Blender, except the H700i and, as always, the Redline 06. This case is kind of boring overall, but that's not necessarily an insult to Be Quiet. Be Quiet and Fractal both take a more visually boring approach to cases, and that's perfectly fine. A lot of people want that. The thing is, though, it's not particularly exciting in noise or thermals. Be Quiet manages to best itself with other cases in each category. And with this setup right here, what we end up with is a noise situation where it's not the quietest in its stock configuration. It's close at 33.1 dBA or decibels. Unfortunately, it also can't really play games at that closer setting, the Silent 1 setting. So without the help of liquid cooling to brute force this, what you end up with is Silent 3 being the best for performance, but is at 36 decibels, so it's middle of the pack to bottom half of the pack, and that keeps us non-throttling, but it's also just, it's not that impressive of a noise level. The temperatures are the same, so it's, if you want to get mid-pack average temperatures with this case, you end up with some of the worst noise levels we have on the charts, and if you wanted to get the quietest noise levels, you end up with some of the worst thermals. So it's kind of, you can pick the middle, but then you just end up with something completely average. And at $180, completely average isn't really an acceptable starting point for a case stock. Now, that said, there's a lot of credit to be given here. The build quality is exceptional on the case. It's got a lot of metal paneling. The invertible tray makes it one of the cheaper, if not the cheapest, invertible ATX case that is on the market right now. And the build quality and modularity of all the panels that can be removed and inverted are also pretty high quality, which for a case that can be flipped around completely to the other side is somewhat remarkable, because typically you have companies that are forced to cut corners in order to make modularity happen, and you either end up with something that is visually unappealing in some configurations or stuff that just feels cheap. Be Quiet manages to avoid those issues. They have higher quality feel, they have higher quality build in general. It's just a matter of being choked for air once again. And here's the thing, Be Quiet isn't targeting a high airflow case, so that's a lot less relevant than with other cases, but they are targeting something that can do lower noise. And the issue is Be Quiet ends up in a situation where their case isn't the quietest, and when you kind of roughly normalize for noise, it's also not the coolest. So it's lacking both ends of the argument, which makes it average. So thermally, noise, acoustically, it's average, but build quality is good. Just whether that's worth it is up to you. There's a lot of really good cases out there for a similar or cheaper price, including stuff from Be Quiet. The Dark Bass Pro is, or actually the Dark Bass Non-Pro, the Dark Bass 900 is like $200. Way better options in general, but it's huge, so that's obviously a potential downside. This is basically for people who want the Dark Bass 900, can't fit it for some reason, but also end up with a lower quality, just kind of acoustic and thermal level overall. So yeah, overall, it's average. That's really all there is to it. If you want to help us out directly, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one. Make sure you subscribe for more. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.